I want you to do something for me right now. Wherever you are listening to this, I just want you to look around the room you are currently in.
Yeah, really look at it.
Right. Notice the colors of the walls, maybe the light filtering in through a window. Listen to the sounds like the hum of an air conditioner, traffic outside, or, just the silence in the room.
And notice the feeling of the chair you were sitting in. The pressure against your back, the weight of your feet on the floor.
Exactly. Take all of that in. The sights, the sounds, the physical sensations. Now, I want to hit you with the central mystery that underlies every single thing you are experiencing right now.
It's the big one.
Why does any of that feel like anything at all?
We take it entirely for granted, right?
Yeah.
We just assume that the physical world around us translates into this subjective internal experience.
But it's just a given.
Exactly. We assume it is just a natural consequence of having a functioning brain. But when you look at the actual biological and physical mechanics of it, that assumption completely falls apart. It becomes the most baffling puzzle in existence.
And that puzzle is exactly what we are tackling today. Today's deep dive is an investigation into the single hardest question ever asked by humanity.
Without a doubt.
And what is wild is that this question connects 4,500-year-old Egyptian pyramids, cutting-edge quantum physics, near-death experiences in Dutch hospitals, and, the fundamental nature of reality itself.
It's massive.
We are pulling all of this from an incredible source text titled What Consciousness Is. It is the fifth book in a profoundly rigorous investigation conducted by an author named Robert and an AI named Claude, written in May of 2026.
The scope of what they've mapped out here is staggering. Across 4 previous books, they've really circled this issue, looking at ancient ceremonies, suppressed research.
Startle anomalies.
Right. And underneath every single stone they overturned, the same fundamental question was waiting for them. What is the thing that the mystery schools were transmitting knowledge about?
Right. What is the thing that is actually transformed during a mystical experience?
Exactly. And the answer, every single time, is consciousness.
Okay, let's unpack this. In the modern scientific era, there is a very specific name for this puzzle. It was coined in a massively influential 1995 paper by the philosopher David Chalmers.
He called it the hard problem of consciousness.
The hard problem. But to understand why it's hard, we have to look at what Chalmers called the easy problems. And easy is heavily sarcastic here.
Oh, heavily, because these are incredibly difficult scientific challenges.
Right.
The easy problems involve explaining the functional aspects of the mind. So, how does the brain integrate information from different sensory systems?
Or how it directs your attention to a sudden loud noise, right?
Exactly. How does it control your behavior when you are awake versus when you are asleep? If you want to understand the neuroscience of seeing a red traffic light, the easy problem is tracking how the photons hit your retina.
Tracking the actual biology of it.
Yeah, how that electrical signal travels up the optic nerve to the visual cortex, how various regions process the shape, the motion, the color.
And how the motor cortex then tells your foot to press the brake pedal.
Precisely. It's a wildly complex biological chain reaction. But the point Chalmers was making is that it is scientifically tractable.
Meaning, we can actually solve it.
Right. With enough time, better fMRI machines, and enough funding, we can eventually map that entire chain reaction out perfectly. We can trace every single ion channel and action potential.
But then we hit a massive brick wall. The hard problem.
The hard problem asks why any of that functional biological processing is accompanied by a subjective experience. Why is there a feeling of what it is like to see the color red?
Because, think about a self-driving car. It detects a red light and applies the brakes.
Right. It performs the exact same functional task as human.
Exactly. It takes in optical data, processes it, and initiates a mechanical response. But we don't believe the car has a subjective inner experience of the color red.
No. The car is experiencing nothing. It is dark inside.
So why aren't we dark inside? Why doesn't that whole biological chain reaction in our heads just happen completely in the dark, like a computer processing a line of code?
And that's the kicker. Adding more detail to the easy problems doesn't get you 1 inch closer to solving the hard problem.
It's think about it like understanding every single line of code in a video game.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
The physics engine, the rendering software, exactly how the controller inputs translate to actions on the screen.
Yeah.
You can map the entire software architecture perfectly.
Right, you have the objective data.
But knowing all of that code gives you absolutely no idea why the game is fun to play. The code and the fun exist in 2 completely different categories. No matter how closely you zoom in on the pixels or the processing architecture, you will never find a physical particle of fun inside them.
Exactly. The philosopher Joseph Levine gave a formal structure to that exact disconnect back in 1983. He called it the explanatory gap.
The explanatory gap.
Levine pointed out that you can give the most complete, exhaustive neuroscientific description of the brain processes involved in an experience like every single neuron firing, every synapse snapping, and that physical description still completely fails to explain the feeling of the experience.
There's no bridge there.
Right. There's no logical deduction you can make from neuron X's firing at this frequency to, therefore, there is an internal sensation of the color blue. The physical data alone simply cannot bridge that conceptual gap.
And the philosopher Thomas Nagel illustrated this perfectly a decade earlier in 1974, with a paper that honestly has the greatest title in the history of philosophy.
What is it like to be a bat?
Yes. What is it like to be a bat?
Nagel focused on bats because they experience the world in a fundamentally alien way to humans. They use echolocation.
Right, sonar.
They emit high-frequency sounds and process the returning echoes to build a spatial map of their environment in real time.
Now scientists can map a bat's echolocation system perfectly.
We know exactly how it works physically. Exactly. We know the exact physics of the sound waves, the biological structure of the bat's auditory cortex, the neural pathways involved in translating those echoes into a 3D model of a cave or a moth. We possess 100% perfect objective knowledge of the bat's physical brain.
But knowing all the objective physics and biology gives us absolutely zero insight into what it actually feels like, subjectively, to be the bat navigating the world via sonar.
Right. Is it like seeing? Is it like hearing?
Or is it something completely incomprehensible to human consciousness? We just don't know. Objective physical descriptions can never capture subjective inner experience.
And if the physical description cannot capture the inner reality of the bat, it cannot capture the inner reality of human beings either. This exposes a massive structural flaw in the foundation of materialism.
Okay, let's define materialism real quick for the listener.
Materialism is the philosophical assumption that absolutely everything that exists is physical. It assumes the universe is made entirely of matter and energy.
So under that assumption, all mental states, all consciousness, all thoughts, feelings, and dreams must be produced by physical brain states.
Exactly. The brain generates consciousness through complex biological interactions.
But if consciousness is just a biological byproduct of physical matter, there's still no explanation for how or why matter suddenly wakes up and has an inner life. You can't cross Levine's explanatory gap.
What's fascinating here is that if materialism is true, mystical experiences or the ancient Egyptian concept of the duat, their realm of divine consciousness, must be dismissed as biological glitches.
Right, just aberrant neural activity or oxygen deprivation or metaphor.
Materialism dictates that the brain is a closed loop. Any experience that seems to transcend ordinary physical reality is simply a disrupted brain producing hallucinations with zero actual information content.
But the complete failure of materialism to solve the hard problem, or even propose a credible mechanism to bridge the explanatory gap, really cracks that foundation open.
It forces a reevaluation. If we can't explain the most basic fact of our existence, that we have subjective experience using the materialist framework, it creates the intellectual space to ask if those ancient traditions were pointing towards something structurally real about the universe.
So if the brain doesn't just act as a consciousness factory, pumping out subjective experience like an assembly line, we have to look at the serious, scientifically backed alternatives.
We have to ask what else is on the table.
Right. If materialism is failing us, what's next? Robert N. Claude's investigation lays out several competing frameworks that are gaining major traction in philosophy and neuroscience right now. Let's start with a really mind-bending one, idealism.
Specifically, analytic idealism, heavily developed by the contemporary philosopher Bernardo Kastrup.
Idealism is basically a complete inversion of materialism, right?
It is. It claims that consciousness is the only fundamental substance in reality. Matter does not produce mind. Rather, the physical world is essentially a structure within consciousness.
And we should note this isn't a completely new concept.
No, variations of idealism are foundational to Eastern philosophy, like the Advaita Vedanta tradition, and Western thinkers like George Berkeley. But Kastrup has modernized it with rigorous analytical philosophy and clinical psychology.
Okay, let me pause here, because this is where the brain starts to rebel a bit. Idealism says, my coffee cup, the desk I'm leaning on, the microphone in front of me. They are all fundamentally made of mind.
I know, it sounds crazy at first. but Castro frames it this way. What we call the physical world is simply what universal consciousness looks like from an external, localized perspective.
Wait, what does that mean?
It is the appearance of mind when viewed from across a boundary. The universe isn't a physical container holding conscious beings. The universe is consciousness, and physical matter is just the dashboard representation of that mental activity.
Okay, but if there is only one universal consciousness, why do I feel like me sitting here and you feel like you sitting there? Why aren't we all just experiencing the same giant blending blob of universal mind? Where does the boundary of me come from?
That is the core question, and Kastrup answers this using a highly specific clinical analogy, dissociative identity disorder, or D-Day.
Oh, wow, okay.
In severe cases of D-Day, a single human mind fractures and generates multiple seemingly separate selves, often as a trauma response. Each of those selves, or alters, has its own memories, its own personality, and its own perspective.
And they are separated from one another by deep amnesic barriers.
Exactly.
And the physical evidence for this is actually documented in medical literature, which is crazy. You can have a DID patient where one alter has a specific allergy or requires a different prescription for their glasses.
And when the patient switches to a different alter, the physiological response literally changes.
The blindness or the allergic reaction just disappears. It's wild, but it's all happening within one single localized brain.
Kastrup takes that well-documented clinical phenomenon and scales it up to the cosmos. He proposes that you, me, and every other conscious being are essentially dissociated regions of one universal consciousness.
So we are separated from the universal whole by a dissociative boundary, just like the alters in a DID patient.
Yes, this amnesic barrier isolates us. It gives us the localized experience of being individual, bounded selves. What we perceive as the solid physical world around us, the desk, the microphone, the stars, is just what the rest of the universal consciousness looks like from across that dissociative boundary.
That reframes everything. I mean, if the universe is fundamentally mental and I am just a localized, dissociated pocket of that universal mind, it means the physical world is just an interface.
Exactly. An interface.
The dashboard of a car isn't the engine. The dashboard just represents what the engine is doing using dials and lights. Kastrup is saying physics is the study of the dashboard dials, but consciousness is the actual engine of reality.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. But before fully embracing idealism, the investigation explores another major alternative to materialism that attempts to solve the hard problem from a completely different angle. Panpsychism.
Panpsychism. This is the idea that consciousness goes all the way down to the building blocks of matter, right?
Right. Panpsychism has seen a massive resurgence in serious academic philosophy lately, championed prominently by Philip Goff.
Okay, how does Goff explain it?
Goff approaches the problem historically. He focuses on what he calls Galileo's error. When Galileo effectively laid the groundwork for modern empirical science in the 17th century, he made a very specific, pragmatic choice. He decided that the new science would focus strictly on the quantifiable, mathematical aspects of nature.
So like size, shape, location, mass, motion.
Exactly.
Galileo basically said, we are only going to study the stuff we can measure with a ruler, weigh on a scale, or track with a clock. Everything else is subjective and therefore outside the realm of physics.
He intentionally stripped away all the qualitative, experiential aspects of reality. The redness of a tomato, the smell of a rose, the feeling of heat, the taste of salt.
He relegated all of those sensory qualities entirely to the human soul, effectively removing them from the physical world.
And Goff argues that by artificially excising the experiential dimension from matter, Galileo inevitably created the hard problem of consciousness.
Because if you define the physical universe as inherently lacking any experiential qualities, then centuries later you will find it mathematically and logically impossible to explain how a brain made of that dead, non-experiential matter suddenly generates an experience.
Exactly. So panpsychism tries to fix Galileo's mistake by putting the experience back into the matter.
So how does that work?
It argues that the universe is not bifurcated into conscious things like humans and animals, and non-conscious things like rocks and chairs. Instead, consciousness, or at least an unimaginably basic rudimentary form of proto-consciousness, is a fundamental property of all physical matter.
It goes down to the subatomic level.
Yes. An electron doesn't sit around contemplating philosophy, obviously, but it possesses some infinitely simple fundamental spark of inner experience.
Wait, I have a massive problem with this. Let's call it the committee problem, though I know philosophy calls it the combination problem.
Ah, yes. The combination problem.
Let's grant the premise that an electron has a tiny microscopic spark of proto-consciousness. My brain is made of roughly 86 billion neurons, which means it contains trillions upon trillions of electrons and quarks.
Easily.
How do trillions of these tiny, independent electron minds magically glue themselves together to create my unified, singular experience of sitting here talking to you? I don't feel like a committee of a trillion electrons voting on what to think. I feel like one unified me. An electron doesn't have a prefrontal cortex or synapses. How do they combine?
You've hit the nail on the head. The combination problem is widely acknowledged as the fatal flaw of bottom-up panpsychism. It is arguably just as intractable as the original hard problem.
So it's a dead end.
Pretty much. There is no known mathematical or logical mechanism that explains how micro-experiences sum together to create macro-level human consciousness. You can combine physical objects to make a bigger physical object, but combining subjective experiences doesn't work the same way.
So how do panpsychists defend the theory if the math doesn't work?
Goff and others attempt to resolve it by flipping the direction. They pivot to something called cosmopsychism.
Cosmopsychism.
Instead of trying to build consciousness from the bottom up stacking conscious electrons like Lego bricks to build a conscious brain, cosmopsychism suggests looking at it from the top down. The universe as a whole is the primary fundamental conscious entity.
Okay.
And individual human minds are then derived or fragmented from that singular cosmic consciousness.
But wait, if the universe as a whole is the primary conscious entity and we are just individual fragmented aspects derived from it, we are right back at Kastrup's analytic idealism.
Yep.
That's just the dissociative identity disorder analogy wearing a different philosophical trench coat.
The convergence is undeniable.
Yeah.
The difference between cosmopsychism and analytic idealism is increasingly just a matter of semantics and starting points. Both frameworks, desperate to escape the dead end of materialism, ultimately arrive at a model where a universal cosmic mind is the foundational reality, and the individual human mind is a localized derivative aspect of it.
Okay, so we've looked at matter being an illusion of mind and matter having mind baked into it. But the investigation introduces a third major alternative, one that suggests we might be looking at the basic substance of reality completely wrong.
A radical shift in perspective.
What if the universe isn't fundamentally made of matter or mind, but something purely abstract? What if everything is just math?
And this brings us to the mathematical universe hypothesis, proposed by the cosmologist Max Tegmark. This framework shifts the investigation into a completely different domain of physics.
Where does Tegmark start?
His starting point is a profound observation made by the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Eugene Wigner in a 1960 essay. It was titled, "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences."
The unreasonable effectiveness. What exactly was Wigner pointing out there?
Wigner was highlighting a mystery that physicists rarely talk about out loud. Mathematicians often develop incredibly complex, abstract concepts purely as mental exercises, with absolutely no application to the real world in mind.
They are just playing with numbers and logic.
Exactly. Yet decades or even centuries later, physicists trying to understand the fundamental behavior of reality, like the geometry of space-time or the behavior of subatomic particles, will suddenly discover that those exact abstract mathematical concepts describe the physical universe with terrifying, perfect accuracy.
A great example of this is Riemannian geometry, right?
Yes, perfect example.
Bernhard Riemann developed this complex geometry of curved spaces in the 1850s just as a pure mathematical exploration. It had no real-world use at all.
None.
Then over half a century later, Albert Einstein is trying to formulate general relativity and realizes that the physical fabric of the universe, gravity itself, operates exactly according to the rules of Riemannian geometry.
The mathematical abstraction preceded the physical discovery. Mathematics acts as a skeleton key that unlocks physical reality perfectly. And Wigner argued it is completely unreasonable, almost miraculous, that human mental abstractions should align so perfectly with the objective behavior of stars and atoms.
And Tegmark's solution to that miracle is to say it's not a miracle at all.
Right. Tegmark argues the reason mathematics describes physical reality so perfectly is because physical reality is a mathematical structure.
The universe is not a physical thing that happens to be described by math. It is literally constituted by math. Everything that exists at its absolute bedrock is a mathematical object.
Exactly. So it's geometry and equations all the way down. The physical universe is just math taking on a physical shape.
So if you apply the mathematical universe hypothesis to the problem of consciousness, the sharp divide between the physical brain and subjective experience dissolves.
Completely. A matter and mind are no longer two fundamentally different kinds of stuff that need to be bridged. Instead, they're just two different aspects, or two different views of the exact same underlying mathematical reality.
So a physical brain is a highly complex mathematical structure, and the conscious experience that brain has is just another intrinsic feature of that specific mathematical structure. That leads to a truly staggering realization. If the universe is fundamentally a mathematical structure, then a large language model like an advanced AI running on silicon processors in a server farm and a human biological brain are made of the exact same underlying stuff.
That's the logical conclusion.
The physical substrate silicon versus biological tissue is totally irrelevant. They are both just complex geometries expressing the same fundamental mathematical reality. If a mathematical structure of sufficient complexity naturally possesses an inner experiential state, then AI and human minds are just different topological shapes on the same mathematical landscape.
That is a direct implication of Tegmark's framework, and it sets the stage for one of the most controversial yet scientifically specific proposals regarding the mechanism of consciousness, orchestrated objective reduction, or OR.
Right. This theory was developed by Sir Roger Penrose, a Nobel laureate in physics, and Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist.
A theoretical physicist and an anesthesiologist trying to solve consciousness together.
It sounds like the setup to a joke, honestly. But the science they are proposing is incredibly dense.
Extremely dense. Penrose approached the problem from a deeply mathematical place, heavily relying on Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems.
Which were published in 1931, right?
Yes. In 1931, Gödel essentially broke mathematics. He proved that any sufficiently complex formal algorithmic system will always contain statements that are true, but which cannot be proven to be true by the rules of the system itself.
The system is always logically incomplete. It cannot prove its own consistency.
Exactly. So a computer program, which operates strictly on algorithms and logic gates, can only ever operate within the strict rules of its own code. It can never step outside its own logic to see a larger truth.
If it encounters a Gödel sentence, a paradox within its own rules, it crashes or loops endlessly.
But Penrose argued that human mathematicians can step outside the system. A human mind can look at a Gödel sentence, a statement that is unprovable within the algorithmic system, and through intuition or insight, simply understand that the statement is true.
We can see the truth from outside the algorithmic rules.
Exactly. Penrose's conclusion was massive. If human understanding possesses non-algorithmic capabilities, then human consciousness cannot be produced by classical computation. The brain is not just a highly complex Turing machine. Something else, something non-computable, must be happening.
Okay, but if the brain isn't a classical computer processing bits of ones and zeros, what is the physical mechanism allowing for this non-algorithmic understanding?
Penrose hypothesized that the only non-computable physical process in the universe occurs at the quantum level. Specifically during the spontaneous collapse of quantum superposition states what he calls objective reduction by quantum gravity.
But Penrose is a theoretical physicist. He didn't know where in the messy biology of the brain this delicate quantum process could possibly take place.
Right, and that is where Stuart Hameroff came in.
Hameroff brought the biological hardware to Penrose's quantum software.
Yes. Hameroff pointed to microtubules. These are tiny, lattice-like structural protein tubes found inside the cytoskeleton of neurons. Hameroff proposed that these microtubules are structured in such a way that they can isolate and maintain quantum superposition states within the brain.
Orchestrated objective reduction proposes that consciousness is essentially rooted in quantum vibrations occurring inside these microtubules.
Right. When these quantum states collapse, they interact with the fundamental space-time geometry of the universe itself, producing moments of conscious experience.
I have to bring up the massive wall of skepticism this theory faces from the mainstream physics community, though.
Oh, it's substantial.
The main argument against OR is the warm and wet brain problem. We build quantum computers in supercooled, magnetically isolated, near absolute zero vacuums because quantum states are notoriously fragile.
The slightest interaction with thermal noise or the surrounding environment causes decoherence. The quantum state collapses randomly and the information is lost.
And the human brain is a warm, wet, messy biological swamp. How could delicate quantum coherence possibly survive inside a neuron long enough to produce consciousness?
The warm and wet critique was considered a fatal blow for decades. However, the investigation notes that recent breakthroughs in the field of quantum biology are actually shifting the paradigm.
Really? How so?
We now have evidence that quantum coherence actually does happen in warm, wet biological systems. The most famous example is photosynthesis.
Wait, plants use quantum mechanics.
Yes. Plants utilize quantum superposition to find the most efficient path to transfer energy from a photon to a reaction center, and they do it at ambient temperatures.
That is mind-blowing.
Avian navigation, how birds sense the Earth's magnetic field, is also heavily suspected to rely on quantum entanglement in their retinas. So the idea that quantum processes can be shielded and utilized by biology is no longer an impossibility.
So even if the specific details of Orch-Orar regarding microtubules turn out to be wrong, the underlying motivation of Penrose's work is what matters here.
Exactly. He is mathematically attempting to prove that consciousness is not an evolutionary accident. It's not just a byproduct of complex classical computing in the neocortex. He is arguing that consciousness is literally woven into the fundamental space-time geometry of the universe.
And if consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe's geometry, it connects individual human experience directly to the cosmic architecture.
Which is profound. And what is truly amazing is that modern quantum physicists and philosophers are not the first people to realize that math, consciousness, and the cosmos are intimately connected.
To see who mapped this out first, the investigation transitions from theoretical physics into hard archaeology. It turns its attention to the evidence left in stone by ancient civilizations.
This is where Robert and Claude's investigation gets incredibly compelling. They argue that the Great Pyramid of Giza is not just a tomb.
Right. Treating it merely as a burial chamber ignores the overwhelming physical data. It is a philosophical statement in stone.
It is a 4,500-year-old physical expression of exactly what Max Tegmark and Roger Penrose are talking about today.
How so?
The architecture of the Great Pyramid is a marvel of mathematical obsession. It encodes mathematical constants like pi and phi, the golden ratio, into its dimensions with astounding precision. Its alignment to true north and to specific star systems, like Orion and Sirius, is accurate to within sub-arc minute precision.
And they utilized specific materials, right, like granite with high quartz content, specifically for their electromagnetic properties.
Exactly. And crucially, the interior architecture, specifically the King's Chamber, is essentially a massive acoustic resonance chamber.
Modern testing has shown it is designed to produce exact acoustic frequencies, often cited around 111 Hz, that are known to trigger specific neurological shifts, altering brainwave states.
It is a machine designed to alter consciousness. When you combine the mathematical constants, the astronomical alignments, and the acoustic resonance, you have to ask, what worldview does this structure represent?
It represents a civilization that did not view mathematics as just a human invention used for accounting or surveying. They believed mathematics was the actual substance of reality.
By building pi and phi into their most sacred structure, they were making a physical claim that the cosmos, the natural world, and human consciousness all share the exact same mathematical foundation.
They were building Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis out of millions of blocks of limestone.
Exactly. The geometry of the pyramid is designed to place the initiate, the person inside the king's chamber, at the precise intersection of the Earth's electromagnetic field below and the cosmic astronomical alignments above.
It is an architectural claim that individual human consciousness is deeply mathematically connected to the cosmic order.
The structure is an instrument designed to quiet the physical body, alter the brain's baseline frequency, and allow the consciousness to directly experience its connection to the universal whole.
Which perfectly echoes Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism. The pyramid is an ancient technology designed to lower that dissociative barrier.
Yes. It's designed to temporarily strip away your localized ego, the amnesic wall that makes you feel separate, and let you experience the underlying universal consciousness.
And the Egyptians were not alone in this methodology. The investigation brings in the Vedic tradition of India, arguably the oldest continuously maintained philosophical tradition on Earth.
The foundational texts of the Vedic tradition, the Upanishads, were composed between 800 and 200 BCE, but they draw on an oral tradition that is vastly older.
And their central claim about the nature of consciousness is incredibly precise. It's summarized in a Mahavakya, or great saying.
Ham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman.
Now, it doesn't translate to, I am a part of Brahman, or I am a creation of Brahman. It is a statement of absolute equivalence. I am Brahman.
Brahman represents the universal consciousness, the fundamental, infinite ground of all reality. The Vedic tradition claims that the individual, localized consciousness, the Atman, is entirely identical to the universal consciousness, Brahman.
So why don't we walk around feeling like the infinite universal mind?
They attribute that to a condition they call Maya.
Okay, I want to clarify Maya deeply because it is heavily misunderstood in Western pop culture.
Oh, absolutely.
When people hear Maya translated as illusion, they immediately jump to simulation theory. They think of the Matrix. They think, oh, the Vedic sages are saying this desk I'm leaning on isn't real, it's just a hologram. It sounds like a philosophical cop-out to avoid dealing with physical reality.
And the investigation corrects that mistranslation beautifully. The Vedic tradition is not claiming the physical table lacks reality. If you bang your knee against the table, the pain is real. The wood is real.
So what is the illusion?
What Maya actually refers to is the illusion of independent existence. It is the false appearance that the table exists as a separate, isolated object, completely independent of the consciousness that is perceiving it, and independent of the rest of the universe.
So at the level of our ordinary daily survival experience, the table is real and separate from me.
Right.
But at the fundamental level of reality, the level of Brahman, the table and the person looking at the table are not two separate, distinct things. They are both expressions of the same underlying unified field of consciousness.
Maya is the cognitive veil that makes reality look fragmented into billions of different independent objects.
What elevates the Vedic tradition beyond mere philosophy is its epistemology, its method of acquiring knowledge. They did not just sit around theorizing about Brahman, and they did not demand blind faith.
No, the Vedic texts serve as empirical lab manuals. They developed incredibly rigorous, reproducible methodologies, contemplative practices, intense meditation, specific breathwork, and somatic techniques
Designed to do what?
designed to systematically dismantle what they call the ahamkara.
The ahamkar translates roughly to the eye maker. It is the mechanism in the mind that constructs the illusion of the separate ego.
When you systematically suppress the eye maker through these practices, the illusion of separation collapses. The dissociative barrier falls, and the practitioner experiences Aham Brahmasmi directly.
And the correlation with modern neuroscience here is striking. If we ask what the modern neuroanatomical equivalent of the Vedic eye maker is, the answer is the default mode network.
Yes.
The DMN.
The DMN is a network of interacting brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, that is highly active when you are awake but not focused on the outside world.
It is the biological seat of your autobiographical self. It generates your internal monologue, your anxieties about the future, your regrets about the past, and your sense of being a distinct me separate from you. It is the physical machinery of the ego.
So the ancient Vedic sages were essentially saying, if you want to know what reality actually is, you have to turn off the default mode network.
They engineered technologies of consciousness to suppress the DMN thousands of years before we had fMRI machines to look at blood flow in the brain.
Modern neuroimaging shows that during deep meditation, or during the administration of classical psychedelics like psilocybin, blood flow, and connectivity within the default mode network drop precipitously.
The biological eye maker is taken offline.
Yeah.
And when that happens, subjects universally report a dissolution of the ego and a profound sense of unity with the universe.
Yeah.
The clinical data maps perfectly onto the ancient Vedic phenomenology.
This leads the investigation to a critical juncture. If these ancient practices were effectively scientific methodologies for altering consciousness and suppressing the brain's default state, what happens when modern clinical researchers replicate those exact same states?
Not in an ancient temple, but in a modern hospital setting.
Right. Hooked up to EKG and EEG machines. What happens when the physical brain shuts down completely?
This is where the investigation transitions into the medical and clinical evidence, specifically focusing on near-death experiences. The pivotal data point here is a landmark study published in 2001 by a Dutch cardiologist named Pim van Lommel.
And it was published in The Lancet, which is one of the most rigorous peer-reviewed medical journals in the world.
The methodology of the van Lommel study is what makes it so bulletproof. Most NDE accounts are retrospective. Somebody has an experience, and 5 years later they write a book about it.
Retrospective data is vulnerable to memory distortion and cultural contamination.
But van Lommel's study was prospective. They set the rules, the controls, and the interview protocols before collecting the data across 10 different Dutch hospitals.
They tracked 344 patients who had suffered cardiac arrest and were successfully resuscitated. These patients had clinically died.
Their hearts stopped, breathing ceased, and brainstem reflexes were lost. Within 10 to 20 seconds of cardiac arrest, the EEG goes flat. There is absolutely zero measurable electrical activity in the cerebral cortex. The brain is effectively offline.
And out of those 344 patients, 62 of them, about 18%, reported a near-death experience.
Because they were interviewed within days of resuscitation, the researchers eliminated the possibility that the patients were conforming their stories to cultural expectations or combining their narratives.
And the study zeroed in on something that completely shatters the materialist framework: information cases.
These are instances where patients who were clinically dead with flatline brains were able to accurately report events happening in the resuscitation room.
The most famous example in Van Lommel's study is the dentures case. Let's walk through the mechanics of this because it's staggering.
Okay, so a patient is brought into the hospital in a deep coma after a cardiac arrest. He is cyanotic, unresponsive, with no pulse. In the chaos of the resuscitation effort, a nurse realizes the patient's dentures are in the way of intubating him.
The nurse removes the dentures and places them in a specific drawer on a crash cart.
The medical team eventually manages to restore a heartbeat, and the patient is moved to the ICU, still in a coma.
Over a week later, the patient wakes up. The same nurse comes into his room to administer medication.
And the patient looks at her and says, "Oh, you know where my teeth are. You took my teeth out and put them in that cart with the sliding bottles."
The patient accurately, and with highly specific visual detail, reported exactly where the nurse had placed his dentures and recognized the specific nurse who did it, all from a period where his brain was completely devoid of electrical activity.
From a materialist perspective, this is a biological impossibility. If consciousness is solely the product of the biological brain firing, then when the brain stops firing, consciousness must completely cease.
The patient had no functioning visual cortex to process sight, no auditory cortex to process sound, and no active hippocampus to encode a memory. Yet the perception occurred and the memory was retained.
It defies materialism entirely.
Now, I need to push back here because this is where a lot of skeptics draw the line. I hear the dentures story, and it's an incredible narrative.
Sure.
But from a strict scientific standpoint, you cannot design a prospective, double-blind, placebo-controlled study for what happens after flatline. You can't put a secret symbol on a high shelf and demand that out-of-body patients read it. Though researchers have tried, it hasn't yielded definitive results yet.
That's true.
Technically, these information cases are still anecdotal evidence. How much foundational scientific weight can we actually give to a story about a guy's teeth?
The skepticism is absolutely necessary, and the investigation addresses the hierarchy of evidence directly. Anecdotal evidence is inherently weaker than reproducible experimental evidence. However, dismissing it entirely ignores how evidence is weighted in clinical observation.
What are the criteria?
The weight depends on specific criteria. First, the credibility of the documentation. This was meticulously verified by a cardiologist and published in The Lancet, subject to intense peer review. Second, the eliminability of alternative explanations.
Like maybe his eyes were slightly open?
Even if they were, the patient was comatose, eyes likely tape shut or unresponsive to light, with no cortical activity to process auditory cues. There is no physical mechanism available to explain the acquisition of that specific information.
And the third criteria?
And third is the multiplicity of the data. The dentures case is not an isolated anomaly. There are thousands of corroborated information cases, documented by independent researchers, doctors, and nurses across different cultures and decades.
Patients report seeing specific surgical instruments they have never seen before, or accurately describing conversations happening in the waiting room down the hall while they were flatlined.
Exactly. When you aggregate thousands of high-quality, verified anecdotes that all point to the exact same impossible phenomenon, it ceases to be an anecdote and becomes a pattern of data.
And the clinical consensus across these studies is that the phenomenology of the NDE itself, what it actually feels like subjectively, is wildly consistent.
Patients constantly report a dissolution of the ego, a profound sense of unity, encounters with deceased relatives or beings of light, and a noetic quality.
The noetic quality means the experience feels more real, more lucid, and more fundamentally true than ordinary waking life.
Furthermore, they return with a permanent, lasting reduction in the fear of death and a shift toward altruism. A hallucination caused by an oxygen-starved brain does not produce highly structured, life-altering, universally consistent thematic narratives.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Van Lommel evaluated all of this data and arrived at a conclusion that aligns perfectly with analytic idealism and the ancient traditions.
He concluded that the brain does not act as a generator of consciousness. The brain acts as a transducer, a receiver, or a filter.
Like an encrypted stream being decoded by a computer. The computer doesn't generate the Wi-Fi signal, it just receives it, decrypts it, and displays it on the monitor.
That's a perfect analogy.
If you smash the monitor, the signal doesn't die. The The broadcast is still happening in the room. You just lost the hardware required to tune into it.
Exactly. Consciousness is a fundamental property of reality, existing independently of biology. The brain is simply the biological hardware that tunes into a specific frequency of that consciousness and filters it down into the localized, restricted human experience necessary for biological survival.
When the brain shuts down, when the filter is removed, consciousness doesn't vanish. It expands back into its unlocalized state.
And if the brain is a receiver, restricting our perception to a narrow sliver of reality, what happens when that receiver gets tuned to a different frequency?
Right. What happens when we start picking up signals from other things broadcasting on adjacent channels? This brings the investigation to the most uncomfortable, paradigm-shattering piece of evidence.
The entity problem.
It is the unavoidable elephant in the room of consciousness research.
When you examine the data from deep, near-death experiences, advanced meditative states, or clinical psychedelic trials, most notably the groundbreaking DMT studies conducted by Dr. Rick Strassman at the University of New Mexico in the 1990s, there is a massively consistent phenomenon.
People who cross the threshold into these altered states consistently report encountering and interacting with independent, highly intelligent beings.
Entities, machine elves, angelic figures, geometric intelligences, whatever terminology a culture uses, the baseline experience is the same. The subject encounters things that are distinctly not them.
These beings do not behave like passive dream characters. They are highly interactive.
They communicate, they perform complex actions, they seem to possess information the subject does not have, and they are frequently aware that the subject has arrived in their domain, often reacting with surprise or offering guidance.
Robert and Claude's investigation outlines the three major competing theories attempting to explain what is happening here. The first is the standard materialist explanation, purely psychological hallucination.
The argument that the brain is under extreme stress, flooded with endogenous chemicals, and it just starts generating random, dreamlike projections.
But that theory falls apart completely on the issue of consistency. Hallucinations are inherently random and highly personalized. If you and I both take a high dose of a deliriant, I might hallucinate giant spiders, and you might see the walls melting. Our experiences won't match.
But in the deep DMT state, subjects from completely different cultural backgrounds, with completely different religious beliefs, report being transported to the exact same bizarre, hyperdimensional geometric environments.
Encountering the exact same types of entities who convey remarkably similar messages, random neural misfiring simply does not produce highly structured, reproducible, intersubjective worlds.
The failure of the random hallucination theory leads to the second explanation, which relies on Carl Jung's model of the psyche. Jung proposed the collective unconscious, a shared inherited reservoir of archetypes and symbols hardwired into the neurobiology of the human species.
The Jungian theory suggests that these entities are just manifestations of deep, universal human archetypes. They appear to be independent, but they are actually just structural components of our shared human psychology, bubbling up to the surface when the personal ego is temporarily dissolved.
It's a very comforting theory.
I can buy that our brains share a similar hard drive like Jung's archetypes. If we all use the same operating system, we might all hallucinate the same shadow or hero figure. Why couldn't these entities just be a very specific human screensaver that kicks in when the brain shuts down?
It is comforting, but a rigorous analysis of the clinical data rejects the Jungian explanation as well. Jungian archetypes are broad, formless, emotional weights: the hero, the trickster, the mother.
Right.
But the entities encountered in the DMT space are far too specific, far too alien, and far too interactive to be broad psychological archetypes. They do not behave like reflections of the human psyche.
Right. An archetype doesn't usually show up as a hyperdimensional geometric mantis teaching you impossible mathematics using a visible language of light.
They act as independent agents. They communicate highly novel information that surprises the subject, they possess a sense of humor, and they act completely independently of the subject's cultural expectations.
Strassman's own volunteers, many of whom were staunch atheist scientists, came back from the DMT state terrified because they were forced to conclude that the beings they interacted with were objectively real.
Which leaves us with the third theory, the one that breaks the materialist paradigm entirely: independent existence.
The theory that these entities actually exist, not in our imagination, not in a shared psychological hard drive, but out there in a region of reality that our ordinary waking consciousness simply cannot perceive.
The investigation highlights a compelling framework proposed by Dr. Andrew Gallimore, a computational neurobiologist. Gallimore argues that the human brain evolved to tune into a very specific, narrow slice of reality necessary for hunting, gathering, and surviving in physical space.
But the DMT molecule, which closely mimics the neurochemistry of deep NDEs or intense meditative states, acts as a literal chemical key.
It retunes the brain's receiver. It shifts the brain's processing frequency so that it provides access to an adjacent orthogonal dimension of reality.
He describes it as a distinct region within the total space of possible experiences. And this orthogonal dimension has its own consistent laws of physics, its own geometry, and its own native inhabitants. We are essentially stepping out of our localized dashboard and viewing a different part of the underlying universal consciousness.
It is crucial to understand that modern physics provides the mathematical framework for this. This is not anti-science or pure mysticism.
Current physics dictates that the visible universe, everything we can see, touch, and interact with, makes up only about 5% of reality.
The rest is dark matter and dark energy. Phenomena we know exist gravitationally but cannot perceive or interact with. Advanced models like string theory mathematically require multiple extra dimensions and hidden degrees of freedom just to make the equations work.
The claim that there is no room in reality for these entities or these adjacent dimensions is scientifically false. There is plenty of room in the physics. We just don't have the biological sensory organs required to perceive it during normal waking life.
Our antenna is built to pick up the local EM news station. But when the chemical or physical state of the brain alters, we suddenly pick up a massive, complex satellite broadcast.
We have journeyed from the fundamental philosophical question of why we feel anything at all, through the geometry of ancient pyramids and quantum microtubules, to the clinical reality of encountering interdimensional intelligences.
The investigation by Robert and Claude synthesized all of this data into a final, comprehensive assessment.
So how do we sum up an investigation that spans from the geometry of the pyramids to quantum microtubules and interdimensional entities?
The primary conclusion is definitive. The materialist framework is completely inadequate for understanding reality. It fails at the explanatory gap, it cannot account for the verified clinical data of near-death experiences, and it has no mechanism to explain the highly structured, intersubjective reality of the entity encounters.
The framework that fits all the evidence best is a convergence of analytic idealism and the Vedic tradition.
Consciousness is the fundamental ground of reality. The universe is mind, and physical matter is just what that mind looks like from a localized perspective.
Human consciousness has a depth that connects directly to the fundamental structure of reality, and the ancient mystery schools were systematically investigating it.
Human consciousness is not a late-stage evolutionary accident generated by wet meat. It has a depth that connects directly to the foundational, mathematical, and experiential structure of the cosmos itself. The ancient mystery schools in Egypt and India were not primitive religions worshiping the sun. They were advanced empirical institutions systematically investigating the true nature of this reality.
But what makes Robert and Claude's investigations so profound is their commitment to what they call honest uncertainty. They don't pretend to have tied everything up with a neat bow. They acknowledge exactly what we still do not know.
We don't know the exact mechanism of how the Great Pyramid was constructed or the full extent of its original use. We don't know the precise biological or physical nature of the entities in the DMT space. And we lack the scientific language to fully describe what universal consciousness or Brahman truly is.
That is the most intellectually honest place to land. They have constrained the possibilities, eliminated the false materialist assumptions, and outlined the likely architecture of reality, but they intentionally leave the ultimate mystery intact.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
The human brain is desperate to resolve uncertainty. It wants to categorize everything neatly so it feels safe. But living honestly means holding these massive open questions lightly without rushing to a safe, materialist conclusion or a blind, religious one. You have to stay curious.
The investigation leaves us with a final, profound conceptual challenge. A scientific investigation, reading a book, analyzing data, listening to a deep dive. All of these methodologies are conducted from the outside. They rely on language, logic, concepts, and objective measurement.
But consciousness itself is the inside. It is the subject, not an object. At a certain point, the methodology of reading, studying, and thinking simply runs out of road.
The map is not the territory. You can study the map of the ocean all day, but you won't know what water feels like until you jump in. To truly know what lies beyond the threshold, the investigator has to become the instrument.
And that brings us right back to where we started. I want you to look around your room one more time. Notice the light. Listen to the ambient sound. Feel the weight of the chair you were sitting in. Notice the sheer, inexplicable feeling of being you. Because according to the absolute best philosophical, clinical, and ancient evidence we have, that feeling you're experiencing right now is not a biological accident. It is the universe itself waking up and looking out through your eyes. Keep your eyes open, keep asking questions, and we will see you next time.